On the afternoon of August 16th, Montgomery directed Bradley to push up to Troon and Chambois from Argentan, and at 6 p.m. that day, Bradley passed that order on to Patton. Patton had now divided his forces without consulting Bradley, and the eventual outcome was that while the 2nd French Armoured Division and the 90th Infantry Division, later reinforced by the 80th Division, were left to butt against the Germans at Argentan, Bradley, without telling Montgomery, ordered Patton to take the rest of his army, the balance of 15th Corps, 20th Corps and the 12th Corps, to Dreux, and cut the Germans off again, closer to the Seine. Patton set off at some speed through undefended country, while Bradley believed that the bulk of the German forces had already escaped from the Falaise pocket. In this he was mistaken. On August 16th, violent attacks against the 90th Division at Argentan alerted Bradley to the fact that a large proportion of the German forces still remained in the Argentan-Falaise pocket, and these still had to be crushed. Montgomery had already directed Crérat to send Simmons in again against Falaise on August 15th, Operation Tractable, with orders to envelop Falaise and the roads leading out of it to the east. Falaise itself was to be taken by the 12th Corps of Second Army, and as soon as it had been secured, the Canadians were to exploit east towards Troon. Another look at the map will make these moves clear. Hitler is later reported as saying that August 15th, 1944, was the worst day of his life, and the German situation in Normandy had certainly deteriorated in the last 48 hours. Falaise was about to fall, the troops there worn down and exhausted. The 85th Division no longer existed, and the 12th SS Panzer had only 15 tanks left. Other units were out of ammunition or out of petrol, and were forced to abandon their vehicles and take to the fields and woods when attempting to escape to the east. Southwest of Argentan, the French were surging forward and were only 11 miles from the British and Canadians north of the Gap. Finally, as if Normandy was not a big enough problem in the west, that morning the Allies had landed forces on the Mediterranean coast. Operation Dragoon had begun. General Bradley also had his problems, and not for the first time the source was Patton. Patton was now anxious to head east, as ordered, towards the Seine, but on the night of August 16th to 17th, he created a provisional corps consisting of the 2nd French Armoured Division, the US 90th Infantry Division, and the 80th Division. These were currently tasked to take Argentan, which was still in German hands. Patton placed this formation under his Chief of Staff, Major General Hugh J. Gaffey, and ordered him to drive north next day and capture both Chambois and Treux, which, again, were in the 21st Army Group zone and outside Patton's jurisdiction. This instruction was an extension of Monty's suggestion to Bradley earlier that day that the Canadian and American forces should meet 7 miles north of Argentan, near Troon and Chambois. But taking Troon and Chambois was a task for the Canadians, or so it would appear. It appears that Army Group boundaries were being ignored at this time, certainly by Patton, and these places could in practice fall to whichever army got there first. All the histories and Bradley's memoirs are vague on this point. Private enterprise in military affairs should usually be encouraged, and the situation was extremely fluid, not to say confused. But, as at Argentan, if Patton pushed forces into the 21st Army Group zone, the result might be even further confusion. Fortunately, Bradley intervened and got a grip of his wayward subordinate. Command of all US units on the Argentan front, including Patton's 3 divisions. 80th, 90th and 2nd French Armoured Divisions was switched to 1st Army, and Lieutenant General Géraud of 5th Corps, which was currently pinched out of the line at Vire, was sent with his headquarters staff to take command. However, when Géraud arrived at the 90th Division HQ, he found Major General Gaffey already there and issuing orders for the push on Troon. This caused a certain frisson between the two generals, and they referred the matter back to Bradley, asking who was in command here. Bradley chose Géraud, and on the afternoon of August 17th, Gaffey turned his divisions over to 5th Corps and departed to rejoin Patton. Géraud postponed the move on Troon and Chambois, electing to wait until the arrival of the 5th Corps artillery. He also revised Patton's plan, ordering elements of the 2nd French Armoured Division to hold the ground between Écouché and Argentan, while the 80th Division passed to the east of Argentan, and the 90th Division, supported by French armour, drove on towards Chambois. This advance duly began at 6:30 a.m. on August 18th, which, as the Canadian official history remarks, was a day and a half after Montgomery had issued the order for the Canadians to close the gap at Troon, and 4.5 days after Patton had been stopped at the Third Army boundary. During that time, says the Canadian history, the Canadians had been fighting down from the north with painful slowness, and the Germans had been making their way east through the Falaise Gap. They were not, however, unimpeded. The tactical air forces and Allied artillery were already taking a fearful toll of the German columns on the roads heading east past Falaise. Patton's corps duly surged away to the east, heading for Dreux, Chartres and Orléans respectively. None of these places lay in the path of the German retreat from Normandy. Only Dreux is close to the Seine, Chartres is on the Beauce Plain, southeast of Paris, and Orléans is on the River Loire. It appears that Patton had given up any attempt to head off the German retreat to the Seine and gone off across territory empty of enemy, gaining ground rapidly and capturing a quantity of newspaper headlines. This would be another whirlwind Patton advance against negligible opposition, but while Patton disappeared towards the east, the Canadians were still heavily engaged in the new battle for Falaise Operation Tractable, which had begun on August 14th and was making good progress. Operation Tractable began with a slight shift in plan from the previous attempt, totalize. The Canadians were not to enter Falaise but to envelop it, circling round to take the roads running east from the town, while Second Army came in and prized the Germans out, although in the final event the centre of Falaise fell to troops of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division. With Falaise taken, the Canadians were to move rapidly east to Troon, 16 miles southeast of Falaise and 5 miles north of Chambois. From Troon and Chambois, the road ran to Gassé, one of the German escape routes towards the Seine, and this move shifted the Canadians steadily south and east towards the American line. This was the plan on August 14th, but the final stages of Tractable were not to work out in detail, and its outcome was largely dictated by the events of the next few days, which was only to be expected in the currently fluid situation. Having tested the German defences astride the Caen-Falaise road at Quesnay during totalize, General Simons elected to have the Quesnay area shattered by RAF medium bombers, while his force went in over more open country to the east, round the Quesnay woods, over the narrow Laizon River, and so south to Jort and Damblain, east of Falaise. This attack began at 11:30 a.m. on August 14th, with the bombing and strafing of German positions north of Caen, followed at 12 p.m. by the advance of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and the 4th Canadian Armoured Division, east of the Caen Road. All the infantry were now in kangaroos, and this attack was supported by the tanks of the 1st Polish Armoured Division, and on the far left by the infantry of the 51st Highland Division, thrusting across the liaison for Saint-Pierre-sur-Dive. This attack went well, but slowly. The liaison was crossed with help from the bridging tanks of the 79th Armoured Division, but the enemy were now active on the Canadian front and brought fire to bear from artillery, mortars and 88mm anti-tank guns. Losses began to mount, but the rate of progress picked up in the late afternoon. Then came yet another of those all-too-common short bombings, this time by the RAF. At 2 p.m, RAF Bomber Command were due to bomb German positions in and south of Quesnay Wood. Over 800 bombers took part, and although most of the bombing was accurate, about 80 bombers, 44 of them from the number. 6 Group RCAF bombed the yellow smoke markers put out by the forward troops to indicate their positions. Les Varga of the Queen's Rifles again. Why it happened has never been adequately explained. The Lancasters flattened the woods and also took out our own artillery and B-echelon supply elements. The bombers saw concentrations of troops and vehicles and clearly took them to be German, and our identification flares were the same colour as those used by the RAF Pathfinders. Before it could be stopped, the bombing wounded about 400 Canadians, of whom 65 were killed, some indication of the great care needed to mark out bomb lines, and one which fully justifies Montgomery and Bradley's concerns over friendly fire incidents in the narrowing gap between the approaching Allied armies. Great care was always taken, but such incidents continued to occur. In spite of this accident, the advance continued into the night, with the 2nd Canadian Division mopping up enemy positions east of the Caen Road as it moved towards Falaise from Claire-Tizon, 6 miles northwest of the town. Further pressure on the defenders came from the east, where the 3rd Infantry and 4th Armoured Division plus the Poles were moving in. That evening the plan was changed, and now the Canadians were ordered to clear Falaise. The advance was pressed during the night, but at dawn on August 15th, the defenders were still clinging on in the ruins of Falaise, although they were now under attack by 4 divisions, 3 of them Canadian, plus the 53rd Infantry Division of the British 12th Corps. Joe Abbott was in this advance with the 53rd Recce Regiment. August arrived, and we had left behind Point 112, known to the lads as Sausage Hill, and advanced towards the River Orne, following a retreating but often stubborn and dangerous enemy. The Orne was crossed on August 12th, and we went on to Recce the village of Martinville, where the infantry advance had been halted by strong resistance from SS troops. We reached the forward infantry and went through them to remarks like, "Sod your luck, mate," which did very little to raise our spirits. Initially we were covered by a morning mist, but when that lifted we were exposed to some very disturbing mortar and shell fire on the approaches to a farm. We decided to send on a section of carriers, 3 of them forward through a wheat field, while Tommy Palmer and I went forward on foot to give covering fire with the Bren if needed. The advancing carrier section became the target for some well-hidden 8s covered by the buildings. 2 were hit immediately, the occupants killed or wounded. The 3rd carrier managed to evade the guns and turn back into the wheat field, while my gunner and I were firing away at the enemy entrenched in the hedgerows by the farm, hoping to create some confusion and divert some attention from the remaining carrier. Our troop officer, Timber Woods, now appeared to the right of our position, turned as if to shout to someone, and was hit by Spandau fire. I scrambled forward with Alec Grant, one of the troop sergeants, in an effort to help, but it was too late to help him. The 80s and mortars were still firing and had set fire to some vehicles on the road behind us, and the position was later cleared by a company attack by the 2nd Monmouths. We certainly established that the farm was defended, but at what cost? The troop had lost its officer and 2 of the lads killed, and 3 wounded and taken prisoner released later when we overran where they were being held captive carriers, and armoured cars had been brewed up, and it was a much depleted troop which rejoined the squadron. We were immediately sent out on another recce to see if an area on the left flank was inhabited by the enemy. We were creeping forward to a bend in the road with Alec, the sergeant who had helped with Timber, in the lead, when there was a blinding flash and bang. Alec's carrier slewed across the road. Jackie Towell, his gunner, was blown clean out and landed in a heap in the road, followed almost simultaneously by Andy Monker, the driver, with blood covering the left side of his face. Our first thought was that Alec had been hit by an anti-tank shell, but it turned out to be a treble-teller mine, hidden by the side of the road and triggered by the carrier's track. There was no sign of Alec, but the armour plate where he had been standing was curled back like so much paper. Alec was found later by some infantry lads, many yards away, where he had been blown by the force of the explosion. The Canadian advance into and around Falaise continued during the morning of August 15th, and met steady opposition, including anti-tank fire, which halted the 4th Canadian Armoured Division at Versonville, a mile and a half northeast of Falaise. The infantry of the 1st Battalion Canadian Scottish were engaged here by SS troops, and the Canadian official history notes grimly that few prisoners were taken, the enemy, partly at least, preferring to die rather than give in. The Canadian Scottish casualties that day amounted to 130 men, of whom 37 were killed or later died of wounds. The enemy was still using that successful counter-attack combination of a couple of tanks supported by infantry and putting up a stiff fight for every metre of ground given, drenching the attackers with machine gun fire. Even so, the Canadians pressed on, and by nightfall on August 15th were within a mile of Falaise. On the following day, General Simonds ordered the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division to complete the capture of Falaise with the utmost dispatch. The 4th Armoured Division was ordered to move on Treune and thereby close the gap between the Canadian First Army and the 5th Corps of Hodges's US First Army, which was now coming up from the west, while the 1st Polish Armoured Division was to advance on the left flank, cross the river dives at Jort, and keep moving to the southeast, hooking around Treune. On this day, August 16th reports came in that elements of 5 Panzer Division's Panzergruppe Eberbach again were attacking the tip of the American thrust towards Argentan. It became clear to all that the Germans, sensing the closing pocket, were attempting to force the Americans back and keep the mouth of the trap open. The Allied armies closing the pocket now needed to liaise, those held back giving way to any Allied force that could get ahead, regardless of boundaries provided the situation was clear. On August 16th, realizing that his forces were not able to get forward quickly, General Crérar attempted to do this, writing a personal letter to Patton in an attempt to establish some effective contact between their two headquarters and sort out the question of army boundaries, only to get a very dusty and unhelpful answer. Crérar sent an officer, Major A.M. Irving, and some signal equipment to Patton's HQ, asking for details of Patton's intentions and inviting Patton to send an American liaison officer to the Canadian First Army HQ for the same purpose. Irving located but could not find Patton. He did, however, reach the First Army HQ and delivered Crérar's letter, which was duly relayed to Third Army HQ. Patton's response is encapsulated in the message sent back by Irving to Canadian First Army. Direct liaison not permitted. Liaison on Army Group level only except Corps artillery. Awaiting arrival signal equipment before returning. Irving returned to Crérar's HQ on August 20th, with nothing achieved, and while such uncooperative attitudes prevailed at the front line, it is hardly surprising that the moves of the Allied armies on Treune and Chambois remained hesitant. At Falaise, 12 SS Panzer was now down to 12 tanks and had little fuel or ammunition left. Even so, they were still fighting. The 85th Infantry Division, facing the Poles astride the dives, was almost finished as a fighting unit, and constant Allied air attacks had obliged the 3rd Flak Corps to turn the muzzles of its 88mm guns against aircraft rather than the swarming tank targets to its front. The 84th Corps, facing the British at Condé-sur-Noireau, east of Falaise, were almost out of ammunition, and the 1st French Armoured Division of the US 15th Corps had come forward to Écouché, southwest of Argentan, and was about to link up with the Canadian drive from the north. Having no choice, Eberbach had put his Panzergruppe on the defensive and was attempting to hold the corridor open so that more German troops, if under attack from the air and shelled from either flank, could still escape through Falaise. Falaise, however, was about to fall, and when it did, the main road east would be cut. On August 16th, the 3rd Canadian Division reached the road junction a mile north of the town, and the 2nd Canadian Division, coming from the northwest, broke into the town and began to mop up the snipers, machine gunners, and anti-tank positions that still remained to contest their progress. Falaise was in ruins, but it was at last in Canadian hands. While the infantry mopped up, General Simonds sent the tanks of the 4th Canadian Armoured Division plunging southeast for Treune, 11 miles away. It was now necessary to press the Allied attack to the east and south, so while Simons's 2 Corps headed for Treune, Crérar directed Crocker's Verse Corps, reinforced with the 7th Armoured Division, to head northeast for Lisieux. This instruction followed a telephone call to Crérar from Montgomery, who believed that pressure from the 2 American armies would oblige those German forces who escaped the pocket at Falaise to shift their line of retreat to the northeast, between Treune and Lisieux. If this was indeed their intention, it was increasingly vital to seize the road junction at Treune. By nightfall on August 16th, the Canadian 2nd Corps Armour was heading for Treune, and Crocker's 9th Corps, having taken Saint-Pierre-sur-Dive, was en route for Lisieux. The British Second Army had taken Condé-sur-Noireau and Flers, the US First Army had passed Domfront, Patten had already reached Dreux, and the fall of Chartres and Orléans was only a matter of hours. The German position in Normandy was collapsing, and on the left flank the 6th Airborne Division and the commandos were making their bid for the Seine, Operation Paddle. Dixie Dean of the 13th Paramortar Platoon tells their story. By midday on August 17th, the battalion was assembled by the crossroads. We did not know what lay ahead, but we were fully confident in our ability to beat the Boche no matter where we might meet him. It was a perfect summer day and late afternoon before the order to move arrived, and we went via Troan to the valley of the River Dives and at a cracking pace to the Dives Canal, where the 3rd Brigade had seized a crossing, and our task was to clear the enemy from the far bank and capture the high ground beyond. This would be a night attack, and we were to give supporting fire from mortars and Vickers MMG as the battalion went in. At 2 a.m. on the 19th of August, I gave the order to fire, and the full power of the platoon was directed against the Boche. 1,000 rounds of Mark 8th MMG landed on the crest of the far hill, and 4 mortars engaged the enemy with 5 rounds rapid mortar fire. We were aware from the sounds of battle that a prolonged engagement then took place, but by the following afternoon the 13th Battalion were in possession of that hill. We were ordered to move up and rejoin, and leaving our platoon sergeants in charge. Fred and I set off by jeep for the battalion, but nothing prepared us for the news we were about to hear. The battalion had suffered heavy casualties in the assault on the ridge. B Company had made the final charge and borne the brunt of the engagement. Our dead were being buried in the churchyard, and the German dead lay everywhere, too numerous to count, and besides, I was too shocked for that. For the first time, the bloody business of war was brought home to me on that hillside above Pluto. On the way down, I relieved a German officer of his almost new Luger. He had no further need of it. While the ground forces were squeezing the enemy, the Allied air forces and artillery were taking a terrible toll of the German forces still in the Falaise pocket. Gunner Bill Hodkinson of C Troop, 4th Royal Horse Artillery, recalls what their guns were doing. Jerboa Battery of the 4th RHA went into action near the village of Bonneil. This was the worst carnage I saw in the Normandy battle, and the battery observation post officers worked from dawn to dusk, shooting the guns at everything that moved in the Falaise area around Fresnay-le-Bouffard in the south, but at a cost. The battery lost 2 OP tanks, suffering casualties, including the D Troop commander. During the 48 hours of action here, Jerboa Battery fired 400 rounds per gun, a total of 3,300 rounds. My worst memory of the Normandy battle was the lingering smell of death around Falaise. Travers Cosgrove was a sapper officer, 53rd Division, and adds another strand to this account. At Falaise, our job was to open roads blocked by strafed horse-drawn transport, hit by RAF Typhoons. On the whole, the Norman roads were good, but at Falaise we had to drive over the dead bodies of horses and men to make progress and up into the fields which were semi-bocage. If the Germans got away, it was sans transport. On August 17th alone, the 2nd Tactical Air Force and the 9th Air Force flew a total of 2,535 daylight sorties over the pocket, bombing, rocketing or machine gunning the enemy below, destroying a vast quantity of German tanks, trucks, guns and troops. Added to this were terrible losses to the German horse-drawn transport and the retreating infantry. Tony King of the Royal Inniskilling Dragoon Guards, the Skins, recalls the stench of the Falaise pocket. The infamous Falaise Gap lay on the Skins' left flank, and we got a taste of the massacre which left behind mile after mile of dead bodies and abandoned equipment. It seemed we would never be rid of the stench of decaying human and horse flesh, and the bloated carcasses of cattle caught in the bombardments. The extent to which the Wehrmacht still relied on horse-drawn transport for wagons and gun limbers surprised us, but of course Germany was suffering from a severe shortage of fuel. On one occasion, from a concealed position, we fired HE at a German supply column and scored direct hits on 2 ammunition wagons, which disintegrated in columns of smoke and fire. When we drove over to examine the remains, by some odd quirk of human nature, we were more saddened by the dead and dying horses than by the mangled human corpses we found there. Reg Plum, the AA gunner from 127 Regiment, RA, went through the Argentan-Falaise Gap at the end of August and recalls the scene 60 years later. Some impressions remain. Tiger tanks in hedgerows, burned or torn by shellfire. Many wrecked vehicles and many more horse-drawn wagons, the kind used extensively by the Germans, the majority of which had been turfed off the roads and were lying overturned in the fields and ditches. Literally scores, hundreds of horses, cattle, lying dead or burned or torn apart in the roads or fields. Beside the roads, more horses and cows, their legs stuck up in the air, a whole forest of limbs stuck in the air, but the greatest impression of all was the all-pervading stench of bodies, animals, and men. You may be assured there was no inclination to linger in the area. It was a round trip, as I remember, going through Argentan, Trun, and Falaise. Our overall impression was one of thankfulness that we had been on the Allied side and clearly identified by the white star on our vehicles. This was the Falaise pocket after the Allied gunners and air forces had done their eerie work on the retreating Germans. This was a rolling, moving battle, a shifting slaughter as the retreating tide rolled east, under attack all the way. On August 18th, the last German resistance was snuffed out at Falaise, and the battle shifted east, to Trun and Chambois, where the American units coming up from the southwest, the 80th and 90th Divisions, were still being held up by the 116th Panzer Division. This opposition would soon be overcome, and with their front in the west collapsing everywhere, the Germans had every reason to worry. But their Führer, Adolf Hitler, had another problem. On August 16th, his senior commander in France, Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, had gone missing, closing the Falaise pocket August 18th to 23rd. During these 5 days, the German formations lost their cohesion and disintegrated into small groups led by men hell-bent on breaking out from the pocket. Belfield and Essamay, the battle for Normandy. The events of the Mortain counterattack had taken their toll of Field Marshal von Kluge. Ever since his arrival in Normandy, he had found himself squeezed between his loyalty to the Führer and his professional estimates of the situation. The former urged him to obey the Führer at any cost. The latter told him that Normandy could not be held and that his entire force would be destroyed if he attempted to do so. That apart, his strength and resolution had been drained by Hitler's constant and unrealistic demands. To hold every inch of ground, to counterattack relentlessly, regardless of the situation, and by the Führer's inability or unwillingness to recognize that a divisional title, 12 SS Panzer, 21 Panzer, now described a unit that might amount to only a handful of tanks and a few hundred worn-out men. And so, as matters went from bad to worse, as his forces were eroded and he was denied permission to fight a sound tactical battle, it dawned on von Kluge not only that Normandy would fall and fall in the not-too-distant future, but that Germany was going to lose this war. Von Kluge took no direct part in the July 20th plot against Hitler, but he was certainly aware of it. Had it succeeded, he would have been ready to stop the fighting in Normandy at once and negotiate with the Allies. When the plot failed and the roundup of conspirators began, he soldiered on, hoping that his knowledge of the plot would not be revealed by those of his colleagues now being tortured in the Gestapo cellars. His inability to meet the Führer's constantly changing demands kept von Kluge on edge, and he had been in serious trouble with OKW since August 8th, when the Mortain counterattack came to a halt. These problems reached a head a week later, on August 15th. On that day, von Kluge set out from Sepp Dietrich's HQ to visit some of Eberbach's units, only to have his staff car strafed by Allied fighters, a common feature of the Normandy battle. Von Kluge and his companions escaped injury, but the attack knocked out his wireless transmitters. His party then became tangled up among the retreating German columns, delayed for hours by traffic jams and by the constant need to take cover as the Jabos swept overhead. As a result, von Kluge did not reach Eberbach's headquarters until midnight, by which time he had been out of touch with his own headquarters and therefore with OKW for most of the day. With the Normandy battle in a highly fluid state, this breakdown in communications was bound to cause problems, but it did rather more than that. Von Kluge's absence from his headquarters coupled with the radio silence rang alarm bells at the Führer's headquarters. Since the July plot, Hitler had become highly suspicious of all the Wehrmacht generals and was only too willing to believe any rumour of defection. On August 15th, the Führer therefore got it into his head that von Kluge's silence could only indicate that he had gone off to negotiate a surrender with the Allied forces in Normandy. Hitler was still brooding over this opinion and consulting his staff about a replacement for the missing field marshal when von Kluge reached Eberbach's command post and came back on the air. The Führer's suspicions were totally unfounded and misjudged von Kluge. If totally disillusioned with Hitler and resigned to defeat in this war, von Kluge was still willing to fight on all he asked was the freedom to fight sensibly. Otherwise, the outcome was inevitable. Normandy was already lost, and the defeat of Germany would inevitably follow. This opinion he had so far concealed, but the root of Hitler's suspicions concerning von Kluge's loyalty was that von Kluge and his forces were no longer meeting the Führer's demands. The fact that his demands were impossible to attempt, let alone execute, eluded Hitler completely. By mid-August, von Kluge was no longer willing to go on attempting the impossible or being forced into actions that only made a bad situation worse. Therefore, when that order from OKW appeared on his desk on August 16th, demanding yet another counterattack, this time an attempt to destroy the US 15th Corps in the Alençon-Carouges area, adding that the 9th SS, 10th SS and 21 Panzer can and must be employed for this purpose. 3 units that had been cut to pieces and hardly existed in any viable form, von Kluge phoned Jodl and told him bluntly, "This order is impossible to execute. To cling to a hope that cannot be fulfilled by any power in the world is a disastrous error. This is the situation." Having decided to ignore the Führer's order to attack, von Kluge had told his commanders to continue the withdrawal to the Seine. As related, this movement began that night, August 16th to 17th, with the pullout of 5th Panzer Army and 7th Army, which were to move east from the area of Falaise on the axis Trungasse-L'Aigle, with 5th Panzer Army leading. This retreat was to be commanded by Hauser of 7th Army, while Panzer Group Eberbach stood off the enemy in the Argentan-Gasse area and kept the gap open. Once the 7th Army were out of the pocket, Panzer Group Eberbach was to disband, and Eberbach was to reassume command of the 5th Panzer Army from Sepp Dietrich. This move might have saved something from the disaster, but when news of von Kluge's actions and a report of his conversation with Jodl reached him, Hitler's reaction was swift. On the evening of August 17th, Field Marshal Walter Model appeared at the headquarters of Army Group B and handed von Kluge a letter from the Führer. Von Kluge was to hand over command of OB West and Army Group B forthwith and present himself to the Führer's headquarters. As he left, the guns and aircraft of the Allies had already begun the final shattering of his retreating forces, grinding his divisions into the dust, increasing still further the number of the dead. The German forces had been encircled. Now they were to be destroyed. The battle for Normandy was then to claim the life of another German commander. On his way back to Germany, perhaps in despair or depressed by his sacking, perhaps in fear of a Gestapo investigation into his knowledge of the July plot, von Kluge committed suicide by taking poison. He was found dead in his seat when his aeroplane landed at Metz, and in his pocket was a letter addressed to his once admired leader, Adolf Hitler. The attack on Avranches was not only impossible, the attacks ordered were bound to make the all-round position of the army group worse. And that is what happened. I do not know whether Field Marshal Model, who has been proved in every sphere, will still master the situation. From my heart, I hope so. Should it not be so, however, and our new, greatly desired weapons, especially of the Air Force, not succeed, then, my Führer, make up your mind to end this war. The German people have borne such suffering, it is time to put an end to this frightfulness. Naturally, the Führer ignored this sensible advice. Nothing changed. The German forces in Normandy were to hold their ground and fight it out where they were. If they did that, then the German terror weapons, the V-1 flying bombs which were falling steadily on London and would shortly be joined by the even more lethal and quite unstoppable V-2 rockets, would result in Allied pleas for a negotiated peace. The V-1s were certainly taking their toll. By mid-July, a total of 3,582 flying bombs had fallen on Britain, killing 3,583 civilians and injuring thousands more. A new evacuation from the capital was taking place. 500,000 people had left London by the middle of July, and another 500,000 would follow by the end of the summer as the bombs continued to fall. At midday on August 17th, a flying bomb fell on a bus in Battersea, South London, killing 28 people. A week later, another bomb fell on a factory at Southgate, killing another 211 civilians. These were the losses caused by just 2 of the 40 flying bombs that fell on the capital that month. But none of this death or destruction would have any effect on the outcome of the battle in Normandy, or force the Allies to negotiate with Hitler. The notion that it would is yet another example of Hitler's growing delusion. As von Kluge had done on taking up the command in July, Model began by making a rapid tour of his now crumbling front and assessing the situation. This brought Model face to face with the true situation, and the plan he came up with was much like the one proposed earlier by von Kluge. 5th Panzer Army and 7th Army would form a defence line from the sea at Touquet to the town of l'Aigle, 20 miles west of Argentan. Paris would be defended by its garrison, and a fresh defence line would be drawn up between the Seine and the Loire. To reinforce the l'Aigle line and form the new one, Model required a considerable number of fresh troops. His request of August 18th called for a restriction of enemy air activity, reinforcement by 20 draft battalions, 5 GHQ engineer battalions, 270 tanks, 9 batteries of artillery, and 180 light field howitzers and transport of 9,000 tons gross capacity. C&C West further asks to be sent the 6 armoured brigades now being formed in Germany. Model might as well have asked for the moon. Not only was there no way of sending this equipment to Normandy, even if Hitler had been inclined to do so, the situation in Normandy had gone beyond redemption. Field Marshal Model swiftly got a grip on the situation, and at a conference on the morning of August 18th, he ordered that the 7th Army and Panzer Group Eberbach were to be extricated from the pocket as quickly as possible, while the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, the remnants of the 9th, 10th and 12th SS Panzer Divisions, plus the 21st Panzer, held the northern side of the corridor, facing the Canadians and the Poles, and 116 Panzer and 2nd Panzer held the southern side, facing the Americans. And so we come to the final stage of the Battle of Normandy, the collapse of the German fighting formations and their destruction under the guns, bombs and rockets of the Allied tactical air forces, as they gave up any attempt to form another line and fled east to the Seine. What happened to the 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army in their flight across the Seine is still regarded as one of the most devastating examples of air power, and the sights that met the Allied soldiers on the roads and lanes as they pushed into the sides of the Falaise pocket were truly terrible. The Canadian history recounts, "The road, as were all the roads in the area, was lined and in places practically blocked by destroyed German vehicles of every description. Horses and men lay rotting in every ditch, unburied dead were strewn about by the score." Eisenhower later recalled, "Roads, highways and fields were so choked up with destroyed equipment and with dead men and horses that passage through the area was extremely difficult. It was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh." A detailed picture of the final days of the Normandy battle is hard to describe, for at this point confusion steps in, as Ron Ludgater of the 53rd Welsh Division describes. "My pal Jim Barrants and I were young riflemen from the Rifle Brigade, press-ganged into the East Manchesters, a Vickers machine gun and 4.2 in Mortar Battalion. The 53rd Welsh Division were heavily engaged in the battle for Evreysey, and then we moved on towards Falaise, following up the Canadian advance, and 4 things stay in my memory. First was the almost complete lack of knowing what was going on, and what we and the rest of the army were doing. 2, when the platoon was parked up on the edge of the wood and then moved forward, we were promptly attacked by American Mustangs. The yellow markers were all laid out forward, but they came in at low level and attacked behind the line, destroying one carrier by fire. 3. Near Falaise it was quite gruesome to ride up and down over dead bodies of men and horses. 4. Mounting some farm horses to round up Germans in the woods. The MPs had erected a prisoner of war cage, and we were able to round up about 200 Germans and bring them in. They had abandoned their equipment and were quite willing to be taken prisoner, and were offering rings and watches in exchange for cigarettes. My lasting memory of Normandy is that we always seemed to be moving on our own. It was a small platoon world. On some days nothing happened, and on others you dug like mad with mortar bombs dropping all around and steel splinters flying everywhere. The worst thing of all was not being kept in the picture, not being told the state of things and the reason for failed attacks. Our advance on Falaise and beyond was mainly due to our armour, artillery, and above all to the typhoons. German units were spilling everywhere as they attempted to escape and reach the Seine. Allied units were surging forward as the scent of victory entered the air or the opposition in front collapsed. As the German forces pulled back, finding a way wherever they could, often by abandoning the roads and taking to the fields and footpaths, disintegration inevitably began in the German units. Order and discipline were gradually lost. Exhausted men sat down and waited to surrender. The Allied forces acted in accordance with the degree of opposition on their immediate front, attacking the enemy wherever found, pushing on until resisted, keeping up the pressure. All this activity took place to the ceaseless drone of aircraft engines, the chatter of machine guns, the crash of bombs and rockets as the J-bows roaming the Normandy skies came swooping down to rocket and strafe any enemy they could find, rocketing tanks and vehicles and horse-drawn transport on the roads, machine-gunning parties of infantry heading across the fields. What can be said with some confidence is that there was heavy fighting on both flanks of the corridor between the Allied units and those German units that stayed to fight and keep the neck of the pocket open, while other German formations streamed back towards the Seine from the west. The German army had been defeated and was now in full retreat. It had not, however, been routed. Plenty of German units, large and small, were still willing to fight. This being so, an outline of the situation on August 18th may be helpful, as will another study of the map. By August 18th, the shape of the pocket was much the same as it was on August 12th, but the pocket was now much smaller. Shaped rather like a butterfly net, 6 miles deep and 7 miles wide, with its open mouth towards the Seine and its bag curving around in a slight bulge from south of Falaise to the northern outskirts of Argentan, the pocket was gradually being compressed. By August 18th, most of the German formations were behind the railway line east of the Falaise-Argentan highway, and in the country between there and the river Dives. The British Second Army were pushing against that bulge at Falaise, and the 11th Armoured Division had patrols in Argentan by August 19th. On the US front, 7th Corps were heavily engaged around Rennes, while 19th Corps were fighting hard north and west of Domfront, and Guéraud was pushing the 3 new 5th Corps divisions, formerly of Patton's army, up towards Chambois. East of the Falaise-Argentan road, the 4th Canadian Armoured Division were moving south towards Treux, with the 1st Polish Armoured Division on their left and the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division on their right. Their spearheads reached Treux on the 18th and Chambois on the following morning. The overall picture on August 19th is that the 80th and 90th Divisions, now of Guéraud's 5th Corps, were coming north and east towards Bourg-Saint-Léonard and Exmes. The British were pushing west across the Falaise to Argentan Road, and the Canadians were starting to extend the pocket now being created around Treux and Chambois, where a scrambling battle was now taking place. Patton had now veered off towards the Seine. His forces were still forging ahead against light opposition, and by August 19th the leading elements of Third Army were only 10 miles from Chartres, astride Dreux, and his right flank forces had liberated Orléans on the Loire. Patton's surge to the east took him away from the main fighting, but Hodge's First Army, having made a shorter hook around the eastern end of the Mortagne salient, was starting to face north and was now forming the southern edge of the pocket, roughly between Argentan and Chambois. This done, the final squeezing of the German forces at the neck of the pocket could begin in earnest. In this battle, Hodges' men were meeting plenty of opposition from stubborn German defenders, as were the Canadian forces north of the pocket. The Canadians were making slow progress towards Troon, making 6 miles on August 18th, partly because they were also encountering heavy opposition, partly because the narrow bridges over the river dives were neither wide enough or strong enough for tanks. However, once across the river, their rate of progress increased, the opposition slackened, and on the afternoon of August 18th, Simonds ordered that the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division were to push into Troon, and the 4th Armoured Division were to push on to Chambois, a move urged on that afternoon by another order from Montgomery. It is absolutely essential that both the armoured divisions of the 2nd Canadian Corps, i.e. 4th Canadian Armoured Division and 1 Polish Armoured Division, close the gap between 1st Canadian Army and 3rd US Army. Ep.13 Armed Division must thrust on past Troon to Chambois 4051 at all costs and as quickly as possible. The Canadian official history records. During the next 2 days, these orders were carried out in the face of frenzied German opposition, which slowed progress both north and south of the gap. Much of that opposition came from the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, which, having escaped from the pocket and reached Vimoutiers, was now sent back in to help the units still trapped to break out. SS Panzer Corps mounted a 2-division attack towards Troon and Chambois, while from inside the pocket, the 2nd Parachute Corps and the 67th Panzer Corps attempted to break through the Allied lines, head east across the dives, and meet up with them. As always, the Germans were willing to fight, and their attacks were truly frenzied. This attack, planned for August 19th, finally began on August 20th, and the SS Panzers ran straight into the 1st Polish Armoured Division and a bloody and hard-fought final battle over the next 2 days at Mont-Ormel. The plan required the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, having regrouped at Vimoutiers, to attack west into the Morteau-Couliboeuf area, northwest of Troon, to stave off the advancing Americans and Canadians and gain time for the units coming from the west. The scene at Troon during the German retreat was a repeat of that scene previously in the Argentan Falaise Gap. It was a gunner's paradise, and everyone took advantage of it. Away on our left was the famous killing ground, and all day the roar of typhoons went on, and fresh clouds of smoke obscured the horizon. We could just see one section of the Argentan-Troon road, some 200 yards in all, in which sector was crowded the whole miniature picture of an army in retreat. First, a squad of men running, being overtaken by men on bicycles, followed by a limber at a gallop, and the whole being overtaken by a panther crowded with men all with the main idea of getting away as fast as they could. Into this chaos the SS Panzer Corps must return, but Model's order clearly came too late. The flow of German units across the Orne had become a flood, and by the afternoon of August 18th OB West noted that withdrawals in pocket have been continuing, bulk of forces now on east bank of the Orne. This being so, the first task of the Allied forces is summed up in the aims of the 2nd Canadian Corps for August 18th to link up with US forces and hold the line of the river dives. Stating the aim and preparing the plan was simple, but as so often during the Normandy campaign, carrying it out in practice was no easy task. At this point it becomes clear that the term Falaise pocket is no longer accurate. The arguments about closing the gap at Argentan or advancing on Falaise can be seen as irrelevant, for by the morning of August 19th the pocket had moved some way southeast of Falaise. The widest point now lay between Argentan and Morteau-Couliboeuf, the narrow neck tightening between Troon and Chambois, the enemy spurting out of the gap on the axis Saint-Lambert-Coudehard-Vimoutiers. The 4th Canadian Armoured Brigade had crossed the Troon-Vimoutiers road, while other Canadian units pushed south from Troon towards Chambois. Meanwhile, the 1st Polish Division had fought its way to Les Champeaux, and with other Canadian forces now coming up, the Troon-Chambois gap had narrowed to a few miles, and the aerial execution of the enemy continued. Perfect weather on August 18th provided the typhoons with a field day for what the pilots described as a bank holiday rush of German tanks and vehicles towards the east. The Allied air forces put up 3,057 sorties that day, claiming 226 tanks destroyed or damaged and a vast quantity, some 3,000 soft-skinned vehicles, stopped and destroyed around the neck of the pocket. Inevitably, with so many aircraft competing for targets, there were more instances of friendly fire. The 51st Highland Division alone recorded no less than 40 attacks by Allied aircraft that day, attacks which destroyed 25 of their vehicles and caused 51 casualties. The 1st Polish Division had already suffered from Allied airstrikes, being attacked on August 8th, on August 14th, and again on August 18th. During these attacks, a total of 72 Polish soldiers were killed and 191 wounded by the Allied air forces, yet another vindication of Bradley's fears about closing the Falaise-Argentan gap with Allied soldiers rather than aircraft and artillery fire. While the Canadians and Americans attempted to close the gap in the east, the British Second Army was pushing the Germans hard from the west, moving their divisions round south of Falaise to avoid entanglement with the Canadians. The British 53rd Division were now south of Falaise and were 5 miles further east and pushing on hard by the evening of August 18th. On that day, the US forces south of the gap, the 80th and 90th Divisions, were brought to a halt before Chambois by an attack from the 116 Panzer Division. General Simonds had already ordered the divisions of his 2nd Canadian Corps to push south at all costs and close the gap with the Americans. From reading the Canadian accounts, there comes the feeling that Simonds wanted to get this Falaise pocket battle over, that the enemy were now being hit hard from every side, including the air, and what the Allied armies had to do now was go in and finish the job by closing the gap and taking the ground and pushing on to the Seine. At 11 a.m. on August 19th, Simonds ordered his 4 divisional commanders, 3rd Canadian, 1st Polish Armoured, 4th Canadian Armoured, and 4th Infantry finally to close the gap. No Germans were to escape, and the 2nd Canadian Division would take over the 3rd Division's line along the dives, so that the latter division could push on and close all the escape routes. As for the crucial meeting point at Chambois, that was to fall to the 1st Polish Armoured Division, who were ordered to take over the area from Moissy to Chambois, as well as Hill 262, in the Canadian sector northeast of Chambois, which was currently reported to be in American hands. As tended to happen at this time, very little of the plan worked out in detail. The situation was too fluid. The Germans occupying the village of Saint-Lambert in the middle of the Train-Chambois gap resisted the Canadian advance, and fighting to hold or take the village, as both sides strove to evict the other, continued throughout August 19th. The 4th Canadian Armoured Brigade was engaging the retreating enemy with artillery, as the Germans, now abandoning the roads, strove to escape across open fields. It was, a Canadian artillery observer reported, an OP, observation post officer's dream roads and fields were full of Germans moving eastward seeking a way out of the trap. The carnage was terrible. The 7th Army breakout towards the north and northeast was led by Panzer Group Eberbach and 2nd Parachute Corps, followed by the 74th Corps and the 84th Corps. This attack was held for a while, but eventually a breach was made north of Saint-Lambert, and according to the German account, some 40 to 50% of the German forces trapped west of Saint-Lambert managed to get through and join hands with the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, although all their tanks, guns and vehicles had to be left behind. To the east of Saint-Lambert, at Mont-Ormel, a hill near the village of Coudhard, just north of the Chambois-Vimoutiers highway, the Poles were now heavily engaged with elements of the 2nd Panzer Corps, which had now re-entered the fray. The 1st Polish Armoured Division had been organised into 3 battle groups, each consisting of an armoured regiment and an infantry battalion, all pushing into the gap on a line between Saint-Lambert in the centre and Coudhard, some distance to the east. The Polish battle group on Mont-Ormel consisted of around 1,500 men with 80 tanks, and for the last 24 hours this force had been cut off from support, with German forces deployed across its rear. Strong attacks came in on the Mont-Ormel position throughout August 20th, and the attacking panzer troops were then reinforced by those elements of the 2nd Parachute Corps, which had managed to get across the dives. Attacked on 2 sides and very short of ammunition, their hilltop and Allied island in a sea of attacking or retreating Germans, the the Poles held on. Unable to take the hill, the Germans did succeed in opening a route up the road to Vimoutiers. With this done, the commander of the 2nd Parachute Corps sent a convoy of ambulances, all carrying wounded and marked with the Red Cross, out of the battle area. It is interesting to note that passing these ambulances down the road took some 15 minutes, and while they were on the road, not a shot or shell was fired as the column moved through. Only when they had gone did the shelling begin again. While the Poles were thus engaged, a final Allied junction drew near, with the advance of the US 90th Division from the direction of Bourg-Saint-Léonard. Contact between the two Allied armies was finally established on the evening of August 19th, when both the Poles and the Americans claimed to have captured Chambois. The Battle of the Gap was not yet over. It appears that much of the 7th Army was still inside the pocket, and Model was very anxious to extricate it, with or without its heavy equipment. On the evening of August 19th, General Hauser of 7th Army having been wounded and for a while believed killed, 7th Army came under the command of 5th Panzer Army. According to the Army Group B situation report for that day, losses in material were very high because during the last 3 days, enemy fighter bombers had fired nearly all vehicles and fuel reserves, and the artillery had been destroyed by fire concentrations from the enemy's heavy artillery. Gradually, the army lost all its communications and was unable to carry out its command functions. A Canadian account from the South Alberta Regiment confirms this account, stating that the German formations moving against their lines were a mass of riflemen, which our tanks were able to mow down. The US 359th Infantry Regiment, stemming the German troops west of Chambois, records that most of the enemy were not attacking, but merely trying to escape. The Germans moving through the Polish lines were made of sterner stuff, and the battle fought by the Poles trapped north of Chambois on August 20th was a sanguinary affair. The Polish battle groups were cut off from the rest of the 2nd Canadian Corps, attacked front and rear by Germans retreating from the pocket and by German units coming in from the east, and were also short of ammunition and fuel. The same is true of the 4th Canadian Armoured Division, which records August 20th as very confusing Germans attacking from east and west, call made to seal off any German escape routes, but units are mixed up and difficult to define any brigade areas. Les Wagner of the Queen's Rifles of Canada provides an eyewitness account of this time. Now we were moving in open country again. To the west, on the other side of the valley, we saw tanks appearing out of the wheat fields, and at the same time out of the valley on this side numbers of Germans started to appear, in full pack and armed, running to escape the tanks. A shell from one of the tanks hit the west of the road about 50 yards away. "Hit the ditch," said the captain, and that we did. From the line of trees I watched more Germans climbing out of the valley, more tanks coming out on the opposite slope. We held fast in the ditch, waiting for orders. By this time I figured I knew exactly what was going on and that we were about 5 miles out of place. As far as the Germans knew, we were either one of theirs or a crack Allied unit that had them surrounded. I took a Bren gunner to the edge of the wood, told him to cover me, and went out to wave the Germans in. Seeing me, a number of them started in our direction, and when the nearest was about 10 yards away, he realized that I was not a German after all. He stopped in terror, face white, and dropping his rifle, began to run back to his comrades, waving his arms and shouting. We could not have that, of course. I raised my rifle and fired over his head, as I could not shoot him in the back. Other rifles had come to bear on the Germans in the open, and those stricken went down like rags. Then a group of 3 Germans started across the road, trying to pass behind us, and I put one through the radio man and toppled him into the ditch. Who is to say what bullet did what, but none of the 3 Germans got across the road. We then stopped a German scout car with a driver and 1 passenger who got out with their hands up, having thrown away the key, which we could not find. By now our prisoners outnumbered us, and although we could have roughed up the driver and made him find the key, it seemed better to stay friendly. By now, from the north, northwest and northeast, the tank attack was beginning, but although we were in action that day, I don't remember much else. The wounded were put in the half-track and a Priest mobile gun, a German first aid man riding with the most severe cases. The remaining troops, including the sergeant and myself, climbed aboard the 2 leading tanks, which had lots of handholds, and the 40 or so German prisoners were lined up to walk alongside under the watchful eyes of the riders. And so we set out in the early evening, and we came back to the lines of the British 51st Highland Division, and that's the way the war went for me. This confused fighting around Trun and Chambois continued on August 21st. German infantry were still trying to escape, infiltrating through the Canadian lines in small groups and being caught in the open by machine guns and artillery. But the main task for the 2nd Canadian Corps that day was to re-establish contact with the Poles. During the afternoon, contact was made with the Americans coming up from the south, and by the end of that day the Trun-Chambois gap had been closed. The German forces to the east of Trun-Chambois were now pulling back for the Seine. Those who remained to the west had little option but surrender. On the night of August 21st to 22nd, the term "nothing to report" appeared in a situation report sitrep at Canadian 1st Army HQ for the first time in a month. There would be some severe fighting and much more skirmishing in the days ahead as the remnants of the enemy retreated to the Seine, but the great battle for Normandy was over. The Normandy campaign as a whole will be reviewed in the final chapter. But what of this last battle, the Falaise Pocket? The myth holds that the battle at the Falaise Pocket was another missed opportunity, and adds that the fault lay again with the slowness and timidity of the British and Canadians. The arguments on the last point have gone on almost since the battle ended, but if national chauvinism is taken out of the frame, the picture is fairly clear. The decision on how to fight the Falaise battle was agreed by all the commanders involved: Montgomery, Bradley, Dempsey and Crerar on August 11th, and if some aspects had to be altered later in the light of changing circumstances, no one argued at the time, except Patton. The answer to the main accusation, that the Falaise encounter failed to achieve all it could have done, surely lies in the figures. German losses in the Falaise Pocket were awesome. The popular belief that the Allied victory was incomplete because the bulk of the enemy soldiers were able to escape, albeit at the price of abandoning their equipment, is simply not borne out by the evidence. Army Group B estimated German troop losses ran at between 50 and 60% of their strength during the 5 days from August 16th to 21st. During that period, the German divisions trapped in the pocket lost 20,000 men taken prisoner by the British or Canadian armies, and about the same number, 20,000 men, taken by the US First Army, some 9,000 Germans being captured by the First Army on August 21st alone. Some divisional totals are also interesting, if somewhat puzzling. The 2nd French Armoured Division took 8,800 prisoners and claims to have destroyed more than 100 German tanks and artillery pieces in the Falaise fighting. In 4 days, the 90th Division, so unfortunate in the early days in Normandy, took over 13,000 prisoners and 1,000 horses. These divisional totals are at variance with the Allied totals, some of which are given above, but there can be little doubt that the Germans were surrendering in great numbers and taking awesome casualties. The US history records that by August 21st, the strength of the 6 of 7 armoured divisions that had escaped the pocket totalled, as reported at that time, no more than 2,000 men, 62 tanks and 26 artillery pieces. Later estimates claim that the total number of Germans escaping across the Seine ranged between 20,000 and 40,000 men. That represents a variation of around 50%, and fails to point out that few of these survivors were combat troops, and that many who got away were wounded. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, the strongest German divisions with a normal ration strength of between 15,000 and 22,000 men, depending on the formations, could barely muster 3,000 men apiece, and some were down to a few hundred soldiers. All of these soldiers were minus their kit, except for personal weapons. Among all the disputes on the outcome of the Falaise battle, what is not disputed is that most of the German soldiers who escaped from the carnage around and east of Falaise had to leave their equipment behind. Overall, German losses for particular units are hard to estimate because their ranks were topped up during the battle. but it is estimated that around 30,000 members of the 1st and 12th SS Panzer Division crossed the dives on August 19th to 20th. These two divisions mustered at full strength some 45,000 troops, so they lost about one-third of their establishment in the final battle alone, and these were crack divisions, filled with highly motivated troops. The losses in other divisions must have been far higher. These figures for the SS are also open to dispute, and seem far too high when some individual unit losses are taken into account. It is also recorded that these SS divisions had ceased to exist as a coherent force and had lost all their tanks, Jagdpanthers and artillery. On August 21st, a strength report on ISS Panzer Corps revealed that 10th SS Panzer had only 300 men in one Panzer Grenadier battalion, no guns and no tanks. 12th SS Panzer had 300 men, 10 tanks and no artillery. ISS Panzer was unable to provide a manpower return at all. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps carried out a similar exercise which revealed that 2nd SS Panzer had 450 men, 15 tanks and 6 guns. 9th SS Panzer had 460 men, 20 to 25 tanks and 20 guns. 116 Panzer had one infantry battalion containing around 550 men, 12 tanks and no guns. These forces were the cream of the German armoured units, and they had effectively been smashed. That being so, it is hard to see where the larger estimate of 12 SS Panzer soldiers crossing the Seine comes from. After the battle, the Falaise area was examined by an operational research section of the 21st Army Group, which discovered within a limited area the wreckage of 344 tanks, SP guns and armoured cars, plus 252 towed guns, with their dead horse teams alongside, and almost 2,500 trucks and lorries. All this within one small area. More guns, tanks, vehicles, equipment and men were found on the American front and littered along the roads and lanes leading from Falaise to the Seine. However incomplete, the Battle of the Falaise Pocket was a shattering defeat for the German armies in the west. Those armies had been shattered, and the remnants were now fleeing north across the Seine. The US official history records the views of an American officer, one who had seen plenty of carnage in 2 world wars, on the Meuse-Argonne front in 1918 and Saint-Lô a few weeks previously, views he recorded immediately after a trip to the pocket. He wrote, "None of these compared in the effect on the imagination with what I saw yesterday at Troon. I stood in a lane surrounded by 20 or 30 dead horses or parts of horses. I stepped over hundreds of rifles and saw hundreds more stacked along sheds. I walked a mile or more where vehicles had been caught closely packed. I saw probably 300 field guns and tanks. I saw no foxholes or any type of shelter or fortification. The Germans were trying to run and had no place to run. They were probably too tired even to surrender. No one who saw the carnage around Falaise has any doubts that this was a victory.